16 people are in a room, trying to strangle a single sleeping man. And they fail. They have total surprise on their side. They have the weapon in their hands. The target is entirely defenseless. The assassination collapses against a catastrophic lack of basic human physics. To understand how a highly coordinated murder turns into a pathetic, desperate struggle, you have to look at the exact mechanics of what happened in the Forbidden City in 1542. It was the year of the Renyin, and the Jiajing Emperor had chosen to spend the night in the pavilion of Consort Duan. This was a rare moment of vulnerability. The Son of Heaven usually slept behind heavy security perimeters. The inner chambers of a favorite consort offered a temporary, intimate isolation. Therefore, the women navigating the shadows knew this temporary isolation was their only window. They did not bring swords or daggers. Weapons of forged metal were impossible to smuggle past the eunuch checkpoints that monitored every corridor. The surveillance apparatus of the Ming court was designed to detect external threats, foreign assassins, and ambitious princes. It was completely blind to the low-level maintenance staff of the inner palace. The maids took advantage of this blind spot, repurposing their immediate surroundings. The initial assault relied on a simple silk hair ribbon. When that proved too flimsy to crush a human windpipe, they tore down a thick, braided silk cord from the heavy bed curtains. This is where the forensic reality of the Renyin Plot diverges from theatrical assassinations. Strangling a grown man to death requires sustained, immense upper body strength. The cervical spine and the muscles of the human neck are remarkably resilient. The 16 women swarming the bed were completely exhausted. They were starved down to their bones by the palace's severe dietary mandates, operating on little more than chronic fear and pure adrenaline. They looped the silk cord around the sovereign's neck. They pulled. Someone tied a knot to secure the loop. That specific movement critically altered the mechanics of the strangulation. Frantic fingers tied a dead knot. It cinched down hard enough to bite deep into the tissue of the neck, but the knot itself jammed. The loop locked in place, leaving just a fraction of an inch of clearance. It was enough to cut off the primary flow of oxygen, leaving insufficient pressure to crush the trachea instantly. The jammed knot locked in place, simply cutting off the primary flow of oxygen. Minutes of sheer, disorganized panic in the dark followed. The Emperor woke up and thrashed violently against the silk sheets. The women pinned him down, throwing their meager body weight over his arms and legs, trying to leverage their numbers against his adult strength. To keep him from screaming and alerting the night watchman, another piece of silk was shoved violently into his mouth. In a desperate bid to induce fatal shock, they drew the only sharp objects they had, their metallic hairpins. They began blindly stabbing him. The autopsy records and subsequent trial chronicles note these puncture wounds targeted the lower torso and specifically the genitals. It was an attempt to use raw, excruciating pain to accelerate his physical collapse. He was suffocating, bleeding from dozens of shallow punctures, and sliding into severe hypoxia. The oxygen deprivation was destroying his brain function second by second, but he was still breathing. Imagine the atmosphere in that pitch-black room. The heavy smell of temple incense mixing with the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood. The muffled, wet sounds of a man fighting for air through a silk gag. The terrifying realization settling over the girls that their combined physical strength was simply not enough to overcome the jammed cord. The longer the struggle dragged on, the faster their collective nerve evaporated. They were attempting to murder a man who had spent decades positioning himself as the living center of the Taoist cosmos. Zhang Jinlian was the first to break. She looked at the purple swollen face of the sovereign in the dim light and saw his chest still making shallow, irregular heaving motions. The psychological weight of the treason shattered her resolve. Zhang Jinlian dropped her grip on the bedsheets, backed away from the suffocating ruler, and bolted from the pavilion. She ran directly through the courtyards to the main quarters of Empress Fang, screaming a full confession in a frantic attempt to save her own life. The sudden arrival of the Empress in Consort Duan's chambers ended the physical struggle, triggering a political and medical nightmare that would consume the court. Empress Fang personally pushed through the paralyzed, exhausted maids. She located the jammed dead knot buried deep in the swollen, bruised flesh of her husband's neck and painstakingly untied it. The man lying on the mattress was entirely unresponsive. The Jiajing Emperor was locked in a deep coma, suffering from acute pain shock and cerebral ischemia. He survived the night. When he briefly regained consciousness hours later, he was completely mute. The severe oxygen deprivation to his brain resulted in temporary aphasia. He lay there, staring blankly at the carved wooden ceiling, periodically coughing up thick, toxic purple blood. The color of that blood was a glaring biological anomaly, hinting at chemical horrors occurring elsewhere in the palace. His inability to speak created an immediate, terrifying legal vacuum. The supreme authority of the Ming Dynasty was incapacitated. The machinery of imperial justice required a swift and brutal response. Empress Fang did not wait for her husband to recover his voice or his faculties. Looking at the timeline of the arrests, the sequence of events points directly to calculated political opportunism. Operating on the borrowed, highly unstable authority of a comatose ruler, she ordered the immediate arrest of everyone in the vicinity. This dragnet pulled in the 16 maids, including Zhang Jinlian, who had warned her. The Empress also utilized the chaotic cover of the assassination to launch a violent purge of the inner court. She ordered the detention of Consort Duan, and shortly after, another high-ranking rival, Consort Ning. Historical chronicles heavily suggest both consorts were entirely unaware of the plot happening in the palace. It did not matter. The trial was swift, conducted entirely outside the normal purview of the Ministry of Justice. Consequently, Empress Fang wielded the swift power of the state to clear the inner court of her rivals. The sentence handed down was Lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts. The procedure was engineered to systematically dismantle the human body while the victim remained conscious for as long as medically possible. The executioners were specialists in pain management, ensuring the victims did not bleed out too quickly. The 16 maids, alongside Consort Duan and Consort Ning, were dragged to the execution grounds outside the palace walls. The imperial bureaucracy then extended the brutal mathematics of the punishment outward. Dozens of immediate family members of the primary conspirators were also rounded up and executed. Your crime belonged to your entire bloodline. Some contemporary memoirs record a strange meteorological phenomenon over the capital during those executions. Witnesses claimed a dark, oppressive fog settled heavily over the execution grounds for days. The city whispered that the heavy smog was the physical manifestation of unjust blood soaking into the earth. The executions were carried out, the bodies disposed of. The entire event left the court grappling with an impossible contradiction. A group of nameless, politically invisible servants had come within millimeters of erasing the most powerful man on the continent. Their only barrier was a single, incorrectly tied loop of silk. In later historical retellings, palace whispers would elevate that jammed piece of fabric to a supernatural status. They called it the knot that saved a god. In later retellings, palace whispers elevated that incorrectly tied loop of silk into the knot that saved a god. Despite the executions, the court desperately needed to answer where this large group of severely malnourished maids had come from. Strip away the embroidered silk and the romanticized battles for a monarch's favor. By the early 1540s, the inner chambers of the Jiajing Emperor's palace had ceased to function as a domestic residence. It had been systematically retrofitted into a biological extraction facility. These girls were not concubines destined for the imperial bed. They were consumable raw material, locked inside a state-funded laboratory dedicated exclusively to manufacturing the elixir of immortality. The architecture of this nightmare started with a mundane political crisis. For the first decade of his reign, Jiajing failed to produce a male heir. In the Ming Dynasty, a childless sovereign was a constitutional emergency, a void at the center of power that threatened the stability of the entire continent. Desperate and deeply frustrated by the endless moralizing lectures of his orthodox Confucian ministers, the young emperor turned his back on traditional statecraft. He opened the palace gates to a stream of Taoist ascetics and ambitious alchemists. Men like Xiao Yuanji and the highly influential Tao Zhongwen offered aggressive, tangible chemical solutions. Their initial mandate was strictly fertility. But as Jiajing consumed their early concoctions, the goalposts inevitably shifted. Why stop at merely securing the bloodline when the same ancient texts promised a way to secure eternal life? The emperor's interest metastasized. He withdrew from the grand audience halls, plunging deep into the esoteric mechanics of outer alchemy, transforming his private gardens into a landscape of smoke and strange fires. The recipes that Tao Zhongwen brought into the sovereign's private chambers read like a modern hazardous materials manifest. The foundational ingredients for these life-extending pills were heavy metals. Elemental mercury, white arsenic, and sulfur were pulverized and refined over roaring open flames in the palace courtyards. The alchemists operated on a principle of metaphysical transference. Could pulverized elemental mercury and white arsenic truly transfer their mineral permanence to human flesh? But there was a catch. To make those lethal heavy metals biologically viable, to safely bind cold stone to a living soul, the alchemists required a powerful organic catalyst. They needed pure, concentrated Jing, the fundamental life essence in Taoist physiology. In the esoteric tradition, Jing is the foundational energy of the physical body, the innate biological capacity inherited at birth. In the highly unorthodox sect of sexual alchemy that Jiajing adopted, the most potent source of Jing on earth was human blood. Specifically, the first menstrual blood of a young virgin. They called it the red lead. This single alchemical requirement fundamentally changed the function of the Forbidden City. To maintain a steady, uninterrupted supply of red lead for the emperor's daily doses, the court needed an industrial-scale harvesting operation. You couldn't just rely on the existing adult palace staff. The imperial administration initiated mass drafts, dispatching eunuchs deep into the provinces with highly specific procurement orders. The requisition list left no room for beauty or courtly graces. They demanded children. In early sweeps, alchemist Tao Zhongwen oversaw the selection of hundreds of girls. Bureaucrats meticulously cataloged them, loaded them onto barges, and shipped them up the Grand Canal to the capital. Over the ensuing years, hundreds more would be pulled into the high crimson walls to feed the alchemical furnaces. Once inside, these children were subjected to a regimen that systematically dismantled their bodies. The presiding alchemist decreed that regular food, grains, roasted meats, the standard heavy palace diet, was burdened with earthly impurities. Would a standard heavy palace diet contaminate their blood and render the red lead toxic to the Son of Heaven? The solution was a radical, enforced diet. The children were restricted to consuming almost nothing but mulberry leaves and rainwater collected as morning dew. A young girl, separated from her family, locked in a vast stone complex, forced to subsist on the diet of a silkworm. The human digestive tract cannot extract sufficient calories or nutrients from raw mulberry leaves. The girls were plunged into a perpetual state of severe malnutrition. Their hair thinned and fell out. Their bone density plummeted. Therefore, their immune systems collapsed. They were kept hovering right on the edge of starvation, sustained just enough to keep their hearts beating until the harvest. The courtyards where they were housed functioned essentially as a high-security ward, smelling of crushed leaves, damp earth, and the constant acrid smoke of sulfur drifting over the walls from the emperor's cauldrons. The extraction process itself was rigidly monitored and left no margin for error. Eunuchs and senior female overseers tracked the girls constantly, waiting for the precise onset of puberty. When the time came, the blood was collected, processed, mixed with the toxic mineral powders, and baked into the dark pills the emperor swallowed with his wine. If a girl's cycle was irregular, a guaranteed physiological side effect of extreme starvation, she was punished. If her essence was deemed impure by a charlatan alchemist looking for an excuse for a failed batch, she bore the physical cost. Resistance to the collection rituals was met with immediate, severe violence. Court rumors and later historical compilations suggest that over 200 girls were beaten to death or died from the cascading effects of malnutrition and physical trauma. They died in the dark. The imperial magistrates, who heavily criticized the emperor's obsession with magic in their memorials to the throne, had absolutely no jurisdiction inside the women's quarters. The girls had no advocates, no legal standing, and no exit. A standard palace maid's contract was already a harsh life sentence. Under Jiajing's alchemical regime, it was a death sentence on a delayed, agonizing fuse. It seems impossible that an entire court could watch their sovereign drag hundreds of starving children into a laboratory and do nothing. But the system was insulated by a grim biological paradox. Could the system be stopped when the very poisons Jiajing consumed provided such a terrifying visual proof of concept? When earlier test subjects or fellow alchemists died from acute heavy metal toxicity, their bodies did not decompose normally. Arsenic and mercury are highly effective antibacterial embalming agents. The corpses of the poisoned remained relatively pristine, resisting rot, sometimes even emitting a strange, sweet chemical odor. To the deeply superstitious emperor and his terrified entourage, this preservation was viewed as the ultimate vindication. Consequently, the deeply superstitious emperor interpreted the lack of decay not as a lethal mistake, but as shedding the mortal shell for true immortality. Historians of Chinese science point out that this preservation effect locked the court into a deadly confirmation bias. Historians point out that the emperor pursued the recipe harder because the corpses of the poisoned looked better and resisted decay, so the fires kept burning. To supplement the red lead, the alchemists began demanding other ingredients. They collected the crystallized urine of young boys, boiling it down to extract hormones. Meanwhile, Emperor Jiajing's own body was buckling under the strain of chronic poisoning. The heavy metals were slowly destroying his central nervous system. He suffered from violent mood swings, sudden bursts of terrifying rage, and severe cognitive fog. He became intensely paranoid, cutting himself off from the outside world. He refused to hold court, leaving the empire's vast administration to proxy ministers mired in corruption while he isolated himself in his private pavilions. Inside those isolated chambers, the terror amplified. The emperor's erratic, chemically induced violence fell without warning on the women closest to him. This is the precise environment that birthed the conspiracy of 1542. When Jinying and her 15 co-conspirators looked at their reality, their motivation was left without a shred of grand political philosophy. Instead of trying to install a new regime, the 16 co-conspirators simply evaluated the cold, hard math of their own survival. They were starving. They were covered in bruises from the overseer's canes. They watched their peers die of malnutrition or disappear entirely after a failed extraction. They knew exactly what the system required of them, and they understood their own absolute disposability. Once a girl outgrew her narrow window of alchemical usefulness, she was simply discarded, absorbed into the grueling manual labor of the palace's internal service sectors. There was no escape over the 50-foot crimson walls. There was no appeal to the Empress, who was herself navigating the daily minefield of her husband's erratic, violent moods. Any attempt at flight would result in severe torture. Jinying and her group reached a point of absolute psychological rupture. The sovereign was no longer a sacred, untouchable deity ordained by heaven. He was just the chief engineer of the machine that was slowly bleeding them to death. And on the night of November 27th, that engineer was lying unconscious in Consort Duan's bed, knocked out by alcohol and a fresh batch of mineral poisons. The decision to twist silk into a noose was born of pure distilled pragmatism. It was the only logical exit strategy left in a world that had abandoned logic entirely. The knot jammed. In the pre-dawn darkness of Consort Duan's bedchamber, around 6 in the morning, the mechanical reality of the assassination attempt crumbled to nothing. The 16 women had the silk cord wrapped securely around the emperor's neck, but the dead knot acted like a solid brace rather than a tightening noose. Panic flooded the room. Several of the maids, realizing the strangulation was failing, pulled their heavy ornamental hairpins and began stabbing the unconscious Jiajing in a blind frenzy, aiming for his torso and groin. It was chaotic, desperate, and loud. The spell of collective resolve instantly broke. Zhang Jinlian, one of the co-conspirators, dropped her weapon and ran into the pitch-black corridors of the Forbidden City. Therefore, Zhang Jinlian abandoned her weapon and confessed the entire plot to Empress Fang in a desperate attempt to buy her life. What she inadvertently triggered was an entirely different kind of massacre. By the time the unit guards stormed the pavilion, Jiajing was barely alive. The emperor suffered severe physical trauma and slipped into a profound, suffocating coma, coughing up thick, toxic purple blood. While the Son of Heaven lay paralyzed with his body failing from the inside, his wife staged a lightning-fast tribunal intended to terrify the empire. The imperial physicians who knelt by the emperor's bed faced a medical paradox they dared not write down in the official logs. The physical trauma of the strangulation and the hairpin puncture wounds were severe, but they did not explain his catatonic state, the rigidity of his muscles, or the unnatural vibrant color of his hemorrhaging. The grim reality was acute heavy metal saturation. His internal organs suffered massive damage, his nervous system fraying. The sudden oxygen deprivation from the silk cord had simply pushed his fragile, mercury-soaked neurological system over the edge into total collapse. He was effectively locked inside his own rotting body, breathing but hollow inside. That medical silence created a massive vacuum of power. Under standard Ming dynastic law, a sudden incapacitation of the sovereign should have triggered an immediate transition to a regency council of senior bureaucrats. The Grand Secretariat would traditionally step in to manage the state apparatus. But this incident occurred deep within the inner chambers, behind gates where male officials were strictly forbidden after sunset. The outer court missed the crisis altogether. Here, absolute authority defaulted to Empress Fang. She immediately sealed the forbidden city, ordering the eunuch guards to lock the heavy timber doors. The empire was effectively severed from its ruler. The inner perimeter was completely locked down. Fang wasted no time initiating what amounted to a trial of shadows. Normally, treason of this magnitude would be handed over to the Eastern Depot or the Embroidered Uniform Guard, the Emperor's dreaded secret police agencies that operated with ruthless efficiency in the outer city. But bringing them in would mean exposing the inner workings of the harem to the external bureaucracy. Fang locked the investigation behind closed doors. The interrogations of the captured women were brutal and swift, conducted through the imperial eunuch apparatus in the damp, isolated service quarters. Evaluating the surviving records of these interrogations, I find it impossible to view this tribunal as an objective search for truth. The methodology points entirely to a pre-planned political purge. The maids freely admitted their guilt. They had nowhere to hide and no defense to offer against the torturers. But Empress Fang fundamentally refused to accept the narrative of a grassroots rebellion. The idea that a group of starving, illiterate teenagers could coordinate a nearly successful assassination against a living god was an institutional embarrassment that undermined the entire hierarchy of the palace. She required high-ranking figures to legitimize the paperwork of the investigation. She found two. The assassination had taken place in the pavilion of Consort Duan, Jiajing's current favorite and a woman Fang deeply despised. Another high-ranking woman, Lady Wang, often referred to as Consort Ning, was also dragged into the interrogation rooms. The sources from the period are tangled, with some historical accounts placing the attack in Chao's quarters and others in Duan's, creating a deliberate confusion that Fang actively weaponized. The outcome of her tribunal was surgically precise. She extracted confessions under extreme duress that directly implicated both consorts as the chief architects of the plot. Did they actually know about the Silk Cord? The evidence heavily suggests they lived in ignorance of the maid's desperate plan. Consequently, Fang used the deliberate confusion and the chaos of her husband's coma to clear the inner court of her most dangerous rivals. The sentence she handed down bypassed any normal judicial review. It was the maximum penalty available under imperial law. Lingchi, the death by 1,000 cuts. It wasn't just ordered for the 16 maids, but for Consort Duan and Consort Ning as well. And in one of the sharpest paradoxes of the entire Renyin Plot, Zhang Jinlian, the very girl who had broken ranks to save the emperor, the informant who had rushed to Empress Fang in the dark, was sentenced to the exact same execution. Her decision to inform on the plot did not secure her a pardon. Lingchi was not a quick dispatch behind closed doors. Practiced from the 10th century until its formal abolition in 1905, it was a highly formalized public dismemberment designed to erase the physical body without a trace, denying the victim wholeness in the afterlife and erasing them from the ancestral record. The women were transported out of the Forbidden City to the public execution grounds at the Western Market. Imagine the sheer scale of the logistical horror. A large group of young malnourished maids and 2 high-ranking imperial consorts, stripped of their silks and strapped to wooden frames in the open air, surrounded by executioners wielding specialized blades. While historical counts in various archives fluctuate between 15 and 16 executed maids, the visual impact of the slaughter remained identical. The state did not stop there. Doing exactly what imperial law dictated for the crime of high treason, the families of the condemned women were systematically rounded up. The male relatives were publicly beheaded, and the surviving women and children were sold into slavery, severing their bloodlines at the root. The Ming Dynasty kept meticulous meteorological records, often tying weather anomalies directly to the moral state of the empire and the mandate of heaven. For several days during and after the mass executions in the Western Market, a dense dark fog pressed down on the capital. The populace, watching the prolonged agony of the young girls and the disgraced consorts, immediately interpreted the unnatural smog as a sign of heavenly descent. Would the populace have whispered about a jealous empress using state justice if the unnatural dense fog had not settled heavily over the capital during the executions? Then, against all medical odds, the emperor woke up. Jiajing's recovery was slow and agonizing, marked by severe bouts of aphasia and lingering neurological damage from his metallic diet. As he slowly regained his ability to speak and comprehend his surroundings, his senior eunuchs briefed him on the events that had transpired during his blackout. He learned about the Maids, the swift tribunal, and the public executions in the market. Most importantly, he learned that Empress Fang had bypassed his authority to order the slow, agonizing death of his beloved consort Duan. Although Fang likely expected profound gratitude for securing the palace, her actions triggered an irreversible paranoia in a man whose mind was already warping. Jiajing officially accepted the tribunal's report, maintaining the public facade of justice and imperial order. But the internal dynamic of the court fractured forever. He never forgave her for overstepping her bounds and murdering his favorite. 5 years later, when a massive fire broke out in Empress Fang's quarters, frantic eunuchs pleaded with the emperor for the order to extinguish the flames and save her. Jiajing simply stood in the courtyard, watching the pavilion burn to the ground with his wife inside. Following the physical trauma of the assassination attempt and the bitter realization of Empress Fang's overreach, the Jiajing Emperor abandoned the primary residential palaces of the Forbidden City. He crossed the adjacent lakes and moved his entire personal court into Shiyuan, the West Park. It was designed as a pleasure garden, but the monarch rapidly transformed it into a militarized Taoist hermitage. For the remaining 24 years of his reign, the Son of Heaven operated as a recluse. Grand secretaries and top-ranking ministers went months, sometimes years, without laying eyes on him. State audiences were canceled. Traditional sacrifices to heaven, the core duty of a Confucian ruler, were routinely ignored. The bureaucratic machine of 16th century China was left to run on its own momentum, while its ruler locked himself inside a private labyrinth of shrines, alchemy furnaces, and tightly guarded sleeping quarters. Shiyuan became a containment zone, built to protect a man whose mind was deteriorating under the weight of severe heavy metal poisoning. Jiajing continued to ingest the very cinnabar and mercury compounds that were actively corroding his neurological pathways. The toxic purple blood he had coughed up during his coma was interpreted by his Taoist advisors as a sign of spiritual transmutation. His physical symptoms, extreme mood swings, paranoia, and sudden bouts of unhinged rage, blended seamlessly with his religious fanaticism. Could a monarch with severe heavy metal poisoning recognize that his paranoia was a symptom of his own medicine? This created a massive logistical contradiction for his security apparatus. The emperor was absolutely terrified of his own staff. Following the executions, the infrastructure of suspicion expanded drastically. Eunuchs and palace women were subjected to multi-stage loyalty checks, daily behavioral reports, and an atmosphere of constant, suffocating surveillance. Yet, his medical regimen demanded the continued collection of red lead. The Taoist circles surrounding the throne maintained that female menstrual blood was a spent essence, or yu shui, which could be alchemically inverted into pure life force for the sovereign. Traditional Confucian officials viewed the entire enterprise as deeply unclean and profoundly taboo, but they had no access to the West Park to stop it. The precise Taoist rituals designed to elevate the emperor above mortal decay and protect his physical body were exactly what required him to bring a dozen desperate, starving teenagers directly into his intimate space. Thus, the very pursuit of an immortal vessel guaranteed the constant presence of starving teenagers near his sleeping body. The Renyin Plot had exposed a fatal flaw in the imperial architecture itself. The traditional Ming bedchamber, with its heavy, multi-layered silk curtains and thick carpets, was designed to keep drafts out and keep the emperor's spiritual energy contained within the room. Jinying and her accomplices had used those exact curtains to trap him, twisting the heavy fabric around his neck in the darkness when their silk cord knotted improperly. The paranoia extended beyond physical security. The Taoist priests eventually convinced the monarch that Empress Fang's violent intervention to save his life had permanently shattered the spiritual purity of his bedchamber. How then does a monarch safely sleep with a woman when he believes every hairpin is a dagger and every silk sash is a garrote? The court devised a protocol that stripped away every last pretense of romance, dignity, or human grace. It was the institutionalization of sheer animal fear. When the emperor required a woman for his evening rituals, she was selected and taken to a separate pavilion. She was stripped to the skin. Senior eunuchs conducted a rigorous visual and physical inspection to ensure she concealed absolutely nothing on her body. No sharp objects, no threads, no hidden toxins. Once cleared, she was laid flat on a large, heavy carpet. The eunuchs rolled the carpet tightly around her, binding her arms to her sides and immobilizing her legs. Eunuchs would then hoist this heavy, squirming bundle onto their shoulders, carry her through the silent, heavily guarded courtyards of West Park, and unroll her directly onto the emperor's mattress. When the encounter was finished, the process was immediately reversed. She was rolled back up, lifted onto the eunuch's shoulders, and carried out into the night. The 16 maids of the Renyin Plot, along with the 2 high-ranking consorts implicated in the chaos, had been executed through Lingchi. The state slowly dismantled their bodies in the public market, doing the cold, hard work of the slaughterhouse to project an illusion of absolute, terrifying control over the female staff. Their families were exterminated. Their names were recorded in the official chronicles as monstrous, inexplicable aberrations. Modern historians, however, read the silence between the lines of those official interrogations. The assassination attempt in 1542 stands as the ultimate matrix of female resistance within the absolute patriarchal vacuum of the Forbidden City. These were girls aged 8 to 14, fed on mulberry leaves and morning dew, beaten daily, bled for their biology, and pushed far past the threshold of human endurance. They had no legal rights, no political voice, and no possibility of escape or retirement. They weaponized the only asset they possessed: their physical proximity to the sovereign's sleeping body. They failed to tie a proper slipknot. They failed to end his life. But Jinying and her terrified accomplices succeeded in something far more permanent. They fundamentally broke the mind of the Jiajing Emperor. They took a monarch who believed he was transmuting his flesh into immortal gold and reduced him to a paranoid shut-in who flinched at the rustle of a curtain. For the remaining 24 years of his reign, the most powerful man on earth voluntarily locked himself inside a gilded cage, trapped in a permanent state of psychological terror, hiding from the weakest, most disenfranchised creatures in his empire. For the remaining 24 years of his reign, the most powerful man on earth voluntarily locked himself inside a gilded cage, trapped in a permanent state of psychological terror, hiding from the weakest, most disenfranchised creatures in his empire.